Hi, welcome back to Frost and Embers, where today I will show you how to create the cutest and spookiest pumpkin man. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and without further ado, let's get started. As always, we're going to start by sketching out our project first. So I have a rough idea as to how I want this pumpkin man to look. I'm just not entirely sure how I'm going to execute it. There's lots of moving parts, so by sketching it out, hopefully it should be able to give me a bit of direction. Beginning with the plastic cloche, it has got a nice wooden bottom, but also has a hole in the bottom so that I could put a light up and in the middle, so that we should hopefully get light all the way up through the pumpkin man. I want it to resemble the stereotypical snowman, so having 3 pumpkins stacked on top of one another. And in keeping with the snowman, I want to give him a nice witch's hat to tie in with the theme instead of a top hat. This is the dome, the cloche that I have got. It is actually a plastic one. I've had this for a very long time and I wasn't really sure what to do with it. I have also made some cute little mushroom cloches as well. So yes, that's the cloche that we will be using. Obviously, cosplay cannot go wrong with cosplay or coloured pastels in order to get that nice vibrant orange that we're after. Some aluminium or aluminum foil and masking tape. We'll also be using the rolling pin as well in a similar way to how we did the ghost. Starting off, I'm just going to roll out 3 tin foil balls, trying to get the pumpkin shape but also making sure that they fit nicely within the cloche. Making sure that the next one is going to be smaller than the original, and then obviously the last one being smaller than that. So here I'm just going in and making it slightly more bulbous so that it has more of that pumpkin shape instead of just being like a flat circle. I obviously need to take into account the fact that I'm going to be building this up with clay and that these will get bigger naturally with the more clay that I'm putting on top of it. So just making sure that I'm not going too big in the initial phase so that I have some room to build upon it. So it's really just a case of building them up until I'm happy with the size as well as the shape of these. I was also very mindful of not having the face one too small so that you could still see those details. So it's just a bit of playing around with it in order to get the right shape, the right size, to make sure that it all fits well. Also just making sure that it doesn't get too tall as well so that that cloche still fits nicely over the top of it. So now that we have got our foil armature ready, we are going to want to start conditioning some clay. And I'm trying to think about what the possible way is going to be best, starting from the bottom or starting from the top. We need to make sure that we are leaving each one open because I want the light to be able to travel up and through so that it shines out through his jack-o'-lantern face. So it's a case of just trying to figure out which way is going to be the best. So I think what I might do is start with the bottom and then work upwards. What I realised ultimately whilst I was conditioning the clay was that I have made this far too solid. I want to be able to pull it out afterwards, so I have done a second tinfoil ball that is much looser, so that hopefully I should be able to pull it out a lot easier. This was the issue I had with the ghost that I did before. I condensed the foil way too much and it just made it really tricky to get out. So I have again just gone in, made it much lighter, much easier to pull apart. I will still cover it in masking tape before I start moulding it on, but then that way it should hopefully be a lot easier to get out than the one I did before. Masking tape is not necessary, it just makes sure that things go on nice and evenly. So I'm just going in here and just covering the ball, but again very loosely, not pressing this down too hard. Don't want it to be difficult getting it out, but just giving it a nice smooth frame to work upon. Just a tip, when you are rolling out clay, it does have a tendency to stick to surfaces. That's why I'm rolling it on greaseproof paper. It just makes it nice and easy to peel off when you're finished. Once it is nice and rolled out and it's relatively even, you can go in and start covering your foil ball. So remembering not to cover the bottom because we have got that LED light that is going to go in the bottom of the cloche, but just making sure that you have covered it relatively evenly. I'm then going to roll out a little snake of clay just to make sure that I reinforce that bottom bit, so when I pull out the tin foil, the bottom bit doesn't start to bend and snap. So now we just want to blend that all through, making sure that it is nice and neat, and then just making sure that the edges around the bottom are nice and clear of clay so that it makes it nice and easy to remove any tin foil. Checking it for size, it fits beautifully inside that cloche, and now just making sure that we can cut round that clay so that that light can go up and through once the tin foil is removed. I don't want to take too much away, I just want to take away enough so that the next one can sit on top of it perfectly. We can fill in any gaps afterwards, that's not too much of a problem, but just trying to make sure it's as accurate as possible. And then just double checking for size, quite happy with that, so we can come back to that later. So this is the LED light that I will be using, and you just turn it and it comes on beautifully bright. I was planning on putting it underneath, but it will not fit, so I'm just going to pop it in the top and it actually fits perfectly, allowing for that light to come up through the middle if all goes to plan. We're now going to move on to the body and the head. We're going to do them all at the same time just to make sure that there is consistency. And ultimately we are just going to be repeating the same process we have just done for the bottom, remembering to leave the underside and the top open for that middle one, and just leaving the underside open for the head. I would love to do this project on a much larger scale, but it's one of those things that just feels so daunting. But let me know if you'd like to see something like that in the future. So now going on to cover the head, and just making sure that we leave just the underside open and not getting into that habit of cutting open the bottom and the top. And then just checking it out for size. I do want to add a witch's hat onto our little pumpkin man, so it's important that there is enough space in the top of the cloche to account for that. Okay, so now we have got the basis, we definitely need to pack out this middle one in order to even it out. But more importantly, we need to cut out the top of the middle pumpkin, otherwise the light will just sit in his tummy, which is not quite the idea. And then just tidying up the bottom of the head pumpkin so that when it sits on the middle pumpkin, it's nice and seamless. So it appears I have lost my footage of me splitting this pumpkin up into sections, but ultimately I just put a pinhole in the top and then just split the pumpkin evenly all the way around. Here I'm just adding little bits of clay to each section in order to bulk them out and give that more bulbous look that pumpkins tend to have. So here I'm just splitting them up so that the bottom section of the clay is wider than the top, almost like petal shapes, so that the bottom is slightly more built out than the top is. So I think it is much easier to see how much of effect this has from the top and the bottom, and we're just going to repeat the same process for the other two pumpkins. So just measuring it out to see how well this is going to fit, going in and just redefining those segments a little bit. I find that rolling the tool makes a much better effect instead of scraping it down, otherwise then you're moving clay, and that's not what I want to do when I'm just defining those lines a little bit more. Taking some trusty surgical spirit and just going in and smoothing that all out so that it blends seamlessly. And once again, we're just going to repeat that process with the middle and the top pumpkins. Here is a much more clear demonstration of how I split the pumpkin up into sections. So I do it in halves and then into quarters and then I split it up again from there. I try not to worry about being too specific with the segments of clay that I'm adding. I quite like how each of them are slightly different, they add a little bit of a more natural vibe. The same really goes for the way that I'm building up the segments. They don't need to be perfectly even, they don't need to be perfectly smooth. Pumpkins often do have indentations in them and different marks, and that is something that I really lean into when I'm making this project. So now that I'm happy with their sizes, I'm just going to go back in with that original tool and I'm just going to roll it again just to put in a little bit more definition, a little bit more visual interest on the pumpkins. Pumpkins usually do have some kind of texture, sort of lined texture throughout, so I'm just going in and adding those into the pumpkins now. Again, rolling this tool, not dragging it. I do not want to move the clay. I just want to apply enough pressure and sort of differentiate that pressure as well so that we get different kind of lines. There is no rhyme or reason here. I'm just going in and doing as I see fit. They are not equal, each segment is different, and that's very much intentional. Just going in with this, I believe it's actually a dental tool, and just putting in some much finer lines, more detailed lines, just again to build up on that visual interest. Now it's time to go in and do the face. So I'm going for a very stereotypical jack-o'-lantern face. So just using these first tools to sketch out where I want each of those lines to go. It is pretty difficult when you have got quite deep grooves on the pumpkins. And this clay was pretty soft, which made it a little bit more difficult than I had anticipated. I tried to be really careful because I knew if I took away too much clay it was going to be difficult in order to put that back in, so I just very carefully started to sketch things out and then worked my way through from there. In my initial sketch, my pumpkin had more of a grimace than a smile, but I wanted this chap to look pretty happy, so I go in and give him a nice little grin. So it's kind of tricky to see, but I have gone all the way through the clay, all the way to the tinfoil base at the bottom, so you can just about see the masking tape peeking through there. So that is just so that when I do put the LED light in the bottom, the light can travel up through the middle of the pumpkin and light up his little jack-o'-lantern face. So carving out his mouth was probably the most tricky part because of all the little indentations and the fact that the clay was so soft. I perhaps should have left it a little while or maybe used something that wasn't as soft as this clay. But then I just go back in and try to redefine everything once I eventually get that clay out. Due to the butchery I had to perform, I did end up adding bits of clay back in to give him back his, so to speak, teeth, and that actually worked quite nicely. So this tool is super helpful, but if you didn't have a tool like this on hand, you could always just use a toothpick, or failing that, a pin or a needle would work perfectly as well. It's just super brilliant in order to get those fine details. So whilst I'm sculpting this, you can probably notice my spooky nails. They are beautiful, my lovely little pumpkins. I will give a link to Sophie's page down in the description if you would like to go and check out her work. So I wanted to add a little bit of character to this pumpkin, so I'm giving him a little chin. He has a slight overbite anyway, but I thought a little chin would just add a little bit more of a cutesy vibe to our pumpkin man. So going back in and using the same technique as before and just rolling that tool over the clay in order to give him a little bit more definition. And because this clay is so soft, I just go back in all the way around and make sure that that definition is visible and that my fingers haven't squashed it too much in the sculpting process. I am super happy with the way that he has turned out already. They stack up beautifully. I think that there is a really nice differentiation in size. I couldn't be more happy with how he's turned out so far. All that's left to do now is to pop him in the oven. And he's all done. I have gone ahead and taken out the tin foil. It was a lot easier, making sure that I had made it a lot looser. The one thing I did forget to do was to punch the holes for his little arms in the side, so I just went ahead and did that before I removed the foil. So now we just need to join up the pumpkin, and we're just going to do that with some Sculpey Bacon Bond and just rolling out some sausages of clay and attaching the top and the bottom. At the beginning of the video I said that I would be using pastels to colour my pumpkin, I changed my mind. Usually you would have to paint with the pastels before you baked it. In fact, you would have to do that in every instance, otherwise the pastels will not stick to the clay. However, I realised that pumpkins are not actually matte. They do have that kind of waxy element to them, and I felt like acrylic paint would actually give a really good effect. So I decided to scrap the pastels, and as you can see in the background, I have got out a series of acrylic paints and I'm going to go in and paint it when he is finished. So I have put Bacon Bond on both the top and the bottom so that it seals really nicely. Bacon Bond is really good at curing baked clay to unbaked clay, and it just really helps it to stick. It's kind of like clay glue ultimately. So now I'm just trying to blend the two together so it doesn't look like one has just been stuck on top of the other, and that this pumpkin body is all one. And then we're just going to go ahead and again repeat that process for the head to stick to that middle body, blending it in nicely and blending it on the inside as well, just so that it is nice and rigid and it's not going to go anywhere. Once that little snake is firmly attached, going in, putting a little bit more of the Bacon Bond and just squishing that head down really firmly and going in and blending it all again. So now it is time for the arms. In my original sketch, I sketched out that he was going to have little stick arms. I have, however, changed my mind, and I do think that stalk arms might be a little bit more fitting. The wire is not necessary, I just think that it creates a really nice solid frame. You could just build the stalk arms directly onto it using that Bacon Bond, that would work perfectly fine as well. So I did run into the issue of the fact that I have made my pumpkin man slightly too big for the cloche that I have. Ideally, I would like to have had a slightly bigger cloche now that he is actually made. So I did have to be really careful with the size of the arms and the angle that I was putting the cloche on. Once I got the arms to a length that was going to work with the cloche, I then just blended them in at the base, and then I'm going to pop them in the oven so that they are nice and sturdy. So now that he's baked and his middle is completely secure and those arms and the wire are nice and secure in there as well, I just go on and start building up the stalks and trying to get a little bit of a twist there for a little bit of visual interest and just adding in some details. I actually really do not want these arms to be symmetrical. I'm trying to give them quite a lot of differences. So just going in and kind of going to town really with those details and making sure that there is lots of grains and lines all the way through there, so that when I paint them I can give them a bit of a dry brush and they will stand out and pop. The catchphrase of the video, we're just going to repeat that process. So we're going to do exactly the same on the opposite side. We're not worried about trying to make sure they match, just creating lots of lines and interest and details as we go along. So now onto the witch's hat. I actually forgot to record this part, but I just drew around some sellotape and then cut out a circle in the middle of that. So just checking this out for size, and one thing I do need to bear in mind is to make sure that I don't make the witch's hat brim too wide, otherwise I'm going to have an issue with fitting that in the cloche as well. So you bet, the aluminium foil is back. So I don't want this just to be your stereotypical pointy hat. I wanted to have that kind of fabric, loved, aged witch's hat feel to it, where it's got the sort of tip of it is sort of hanging down. So I'm trying to build this up, but so that it is going to sit properly on the pumpkin's head, being really mindful that it still needs to fit in that cloche and that it can't be too high, and accounting for that clay on top of it. So just whizzing a little bit more masking tape around that so that the clay sticks to it a lot smoother. I do want this to be quite thin, this hat. I don't want it to be overly thick. Again, I need to be really conscious of how I am going to build it up so that it is not taking up too much room in that cloche. This was actually a little bit more difficult than I thought it might be. I wanted it to sort of fall a bit like fabric and to have those natural creases in it, but it didn't seem to fall as easily as I thought it might do. So I do lots of fussing and futzing around with it in order to get it in the shape that I wanted it. Once I'm somewhat happy with it, I then start to attach it to the brim of the hat, just popping it in the middle and then building it up with little snakes of clay and blending them together. So at this point I noticed that the brim of the hat was actually a little bit too wide in the front, I do go in and fix that. I go and trim it off so that it is a little bit more symmetrical all the way around. So I go back in with my surgical spirit to smooth things out. I have heard that baby oil also works really well for this. I have never used it, I can't vouch for it, but you could always use that as a substitute, perhaps do some experimentation with it. But surgical spirit is brilliant, it gets that lint off as well, any dust that the clay has accumulated. I'm not too worried about that in this video though, because I'm going to go in with acrylic and that tends to hide all flaws that pop up along the way. But just trying to smooth it out and make sure that it looks nice and neat and tidy. And using that silicone tool just to add in those extra details before I pop it in the oven. So now that the witch's hat is cooled, it's out of the oven, I'm going to go in with some acrylic Payne's Grey, and I'm just going to give it a nice coat inside and out, not too thick because I will give it 2 coats anyway. It has been a long time since I've used acrylic on polymer clay, and I actually found it really relaxing. I think it was a really nice therapeutic opportunity to go back to my roots and enjoy some acrylic painting. So one thing I really regret not doing was painting the inside before I assembled the pumpkins together. You can actually put acrylic paint in the oven, you can bake it with the polymer clay, and I should have done that because I have a feeling you might see it through his face. However, we overcome that, it isn't too much of an issue. The inside is also a bit messy, but then so are the inside of pumpkins when you carve them, so I'm just trying to embrace that. So here's the part where we start to bring it all together. So I've got a yellow, a couple of different oranges, and I'm going to create a kind of gradient as I start to paint upwards. So I'm just going to go in with a vibrant orange all over, and then I'll go over the base coat with a little bit more dimension and some darker tones here and there to draw our attention to particular aspects, particularly down the segment grooves and in those little mini lines that I made just to make them stand out a little bit more. I really love this vibrant orange, and I feel like if I was going for a sort of a more cartoony vibe, I think it would be really, really cute to just stick with the base coat. So this bit was a little bit more fiddly than I had perhaps anticipated, so I took a much smaller brush and blended a really, really light orange to mirror the inside of the pumpkin. I wasn't too worried about being precious here because acrylic is so forgiving as a medium, but it really was so tricky to get in and out of those grooves. But I tried to be as tidy as I possibly could. I just really wanted there to be some idea that it's the pumpkin flesh on the inside. Your eye is very much drawn to that really light colour. It actually isn't drawn too much to the back of the pumpkin like I thought it would be, so I was really happy about that. But perhaps in future, if I were to do this project over again or on a slightly larger scale, I would definitely paint the interior of the pumpkin this kind of fleshy pumpkin colour. So now's the part where I'm going to mix up a little bit of that orange with some brown and go in and just create a little bit more dimension. So although he is super cute, I do still want him to have a little bit of that spooky vibe, so just by making him a little bit darker, I think it really brings that idea forth. So I do want to go into those crevices in between those segments and make those lines a little bit darker, again just to add a little bit more interest and to draw attention to any kind of natural shadows that might fall. So I changed my brush to a slightly smaller one in order to get a little bit more precision. By watering down the acrylic paint, you can get sort of a really nice brown wash instead of it going on too thick and covering up any paint jobs you already have done. Now it's time to give his arms some colour, so I've got a nice green as well as going in with a brown and just mixing these together to get a sort of stalky kind of colour and then blending those onto his arms. So I fuss around with these, giving them a couple of coats and then just go in later on and give them a bit of a dry brush with some of that brown to draw out those nice grooves and details. Now that our witch's hat is fully dry, I'm going to take a much firmer brush and I'm going to go in with some white paint and just give it a little bit of a dry brush in order to make it look a little bit more weathered. As you can see, it makes it look a little bit more aged, and then I'm going to go in with a little bit more of a green hue and just go over the top of that again with the dry brushing technique, making sure I've got very little on my brush in order to kind of give it a little bit of an eerie vibe. With the base, I want to make it look like he is in a nice little setting, so I'm going in with some Yoo-Hoo glue and some of this artificial moss, and I'm just going to spread some glue around the bottom of the cloche nice and generously. I don't want it to be too thin because I want the moss to stick to it nicely, and then I'm just going to break it up into small bits and just sprinkle it all over the top, making sure that I push it down so that it sticks nice and firmly. I use this moss for so many different projects, and it's so cheap and you can get it online. I bought this, I believe, when I was last on holiday in the States, and I got it from Michaels, but I know that you can get it on Amazon, and it is just so versatile. I use it for so many different things. I just love it so much. Going in and just doing the other half, I just like to do it in 2 separate sections. The glue doesn't dry overly quick, but it just means I don't have to work as fast as perhaps I might have thought I needed to. I also just want to make sure that I'm not covering up that hole so that our LED light can sit in there perfectly nice and snug. So I'm going to go in with a black paint and I'm just going to paint the bottom of that cloche just to kind of emphasise the spookiness. As much as I really like the whole natural wood feel, I definitely think that this really completes the look and ties it in with the colour of the hat. And once this is finished, I think we are ready for the reveal.